Chapter 1. The Whispering Sea. The sea stretched endlessly, its surface trembling under the breath of a waning twilight. Waves moved like restless secrets, whispering tales of lives lost and found along their endless paths. The air was heavy with salt, a tangible reminder of the timelessness that belonged to the ocean. Along the shoreline, the sky bled hues of amber and violet, the sun sinking reluctantly into the horizon as if unwilling to abandon the world below. Elara often sought refuge here, where the sand met the water in a tenuous dance of erosion and renewal. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared aimless, a solitary figure with a windswept cloak and hair tangled in the briny air. But within her, a storm raged. A cacophony of questions without answers, regrets without resolution. The sea was the only place that seemed to listen without judgment, its ebb and flow mimicking the tides of her own restless heart. Elara's life had once been as still as the calm before a storm. She was born into a family whose love was quiet, measured, and distant, like a fragile artifact meant to be admired but never touched. She grew up learning to swallow her desires, to bury her passions beneath layers of expectation. The sea, vast and unpredictable, had become her only confidant, its whispers a solace she could not find in human company. The horizon called to her as it always had, beckoning her to places unseen, promising freedom from the invisible chains that bound her. Yet, it was not the horizon itself that kept her rooted to this shore, but the memory of a man who had once stood beside her on these sands. A man whose presence had once been as commanding and eternal as the sea itself. His name was Kale, a traveler with eyes as restless as the waves he loved to chase. They had met by chance, if chance could be the name for something that felt so inevitable. Elara remembered every detail. The way his voice carried over the sound of the crashing surf, how his hands moved as if sculpting invisible worlds, and the way he looked at her as if he could see the parts of herself she had hidden from everyone, including herself. For a brief season, they had shared this shore and the fragile bridge of a love that grew not from words, but from the spaces between them. Kale had brought color to the gray monotony of her days, and Elara had offered him an anchor he never knew he needed. Together, they dreamed of voyages neither had the courage to take alone. But dreams, like waves, were fleeting, and Kale had always belonged to the sea more than to the land, or to her. One morning, she had woken to find him gone. The horizon she once longed for had swallowed him whole, leaving only footprints in the sand that the tide had long since erased. He had left no note, no explanation, only the vast, echoing silence of his absence. Yet, Elara could not hate him for it. She had known, even in those moments when his hand clasped hers, that he was always destined to leave. People like Kale were not meant to be kept. The sea had become her inheritance, the keeper of all that was unresolved between them. She walked its edge daily, not in search of him, but of the part of herself she had lost when he disappeared. Each step she took left an imprint, a fleeting testimony to her presence in a world that seemed determined to forget her. This evening was no different. The tide was rising, the waves licking hungrily at her feet as if trying to draw her into their depths. She stood still, her toes sinking into the wet sand, and watched as the first stars began to emerge. Above her, the heavens seemed infinite, as boundless and unknowable as the ocean. Yet, as she stared, she felt a quiet certainty growing within her, a conviction that the sea was not simply a void but a mirror, reflecting back all the pieces of herself she had yet to reclaim. Farther down the shore, a weathered bottle lay half buried in the sand, glinting faintly in the dying light. It was small and unassuming, its glass worn smooth by the relentless caress of the waves. Elara picked it up, the texture cold and familiar against her fingertips. Inside, She found a piece of parchment rolled tightly and sealed with a wax emblem she didn't recognize. The whispering sea seemed to hush as she unrolled the paper, her heart thrumming like the tide. The words etched there were few but potent, carrying the weight of 1,000 questions. They spoke not of love, but of loss and longing, written in a hand she could not mistake. Cale's voice, silent for so long, seemed to echo from the ink-stained lines, bridging the impossible distance between them. The sea had spoken once again, and Elara, for the first time in years, felt a stirring of something she had thought long buried. Not hope. No, hope was too fragile for someone like her, but something deeper, more enduring. A pull, like the tide, drawing her toward a horizon she had once feared to cross. She folded the note carefully and held it close, the bottle still clutched in her other hand. The waves surged forward, washing over her feet and pulling back, as if urging her onward. As the stars above brightened, the sea whispered once more, its voice both a question and a promise. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Ashes. The valley had once been a cradle of green, a sanctuary for life that thrived in harmonious defiance of time. Now, it lay shrouded in a veil of smoke and ash, its trees stripped bare, their charred remains reaching skyward like the skeletal fingers of forgotten giants. The fire had come suddenly, devouring the land with an appetite both ruthless and indifferent. What remained was a barren wasteland, a scorched echo of what once was. Among the ashes walked a solitary figure, her silhouette blurred by the gray haze that hung heavy in the air. Elara had arrived only days after the inferno had swept through, drawn by a compulsion she could neither name nor resist. The bottle and its note had remained with her since the night she found them, a haunting reminder of Cale and the life she had once imagined for them. The words he had written, cryptic, fragmented, had spoken of loss and a place where even the fire weeps. It had taken her days to understand, but now she stood where the fire had wept, in a land stripped bare by its fury. The ground crunched beneath her boots, each step releasing the faint scent of charred wood and earth. Ash coated her clothes and clung to her skin, turning her into a pale ghost among the ruins. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of a dying tree collapsing under its own weight. It was a silence that felt alive, oppressive, as if the land itself mourned what it had lost. Elara paused beside the remnants of what had once been a mighty oak. Its hollowed trunk stood as a monument to endurance, its roots still clawing at the earth in defiance of its own destruction. She reached out to touch the blackened bark, her fingers brushing against the brittle surface. The tree crumbled under her touch, disintegrating into a fine dust that swirled away on the faintest breath of wind. She wondered what Cale had seen here, what had compelled him to leave behind a fragment of his soul in the form of those words. The fire, she thought, was a fitting metaphor for him. He had burned brightly, consuming everything in his path, leaving behind a warmth that lingered long after he was gone, but also scars deep and indelible. As she moved deeper into the valley, she came across the husk of a small house. It stood apart from the blackened forest, its stone walls cracked but intact, its roof collapsed into a heap of cinders. The air around it seemed heavier, as if it carried the weight of the lives that had once inhabited the space. Elara hesitated at the threshold, the doorway gaping like the mouth of some ancient beast. She stepped inside, her boots disturbing the layer of ash that coated the floor. The interior was almost unrecognizable, a chaotic tangle of burned beams and shattered pottery. Yet, amidst the destruction, her eyes caught a glimmer of something unscathed. She bent down, her fingers brushing against a small, tarnished locket. It was simple, its metal warped slightly from the heat, but when she pried it open, The faint image of a woman stared back at her, faded yet unmistakably human. She felt an ache she couldn't place, as if the locket carried not just the weight of someone's memory, but an echo of their pain. Elara slipped the locket into her pocket and rose to her feet, her gaze drawn to the far corner of the room. There, amidst the debris, lay the remnants of a desk. Its surface was scorched, the wood splintered and broken, but a single drawer remained intact. She pulled it open with a hesitant hand, revealing a stack of papers singed at the edges. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were not. They spoke of longing, of regret, and of a love that could never be fully realized. Each page felt like a fragment of a greater whole, a puzzle she could not yet piece together. There were passages that spoke of a journey, of a man who sought to outrun his own shadow, and of a woman who had tethered him to the earth even as he yearned for the sky. The imagery was vivid, the emotions raw, and Elara felt as though she were reading the echoes of her own heart. She sat on the floor, the papers spread around her like fallen leaves, and tried to make sense of what she had found. The words were too personal, too intimate to belong to anyone but Kale. Yet, they hinted at a life she had never known, a pain he had never shared with her. They spoke of another woman, another time, and a loss that had shaped him in ways she could only begin to understand. The sun was low on the horizon when Elara finally stood, her legs stiff from sitting too long on the cold, ash-covered ground. She gathered the papers carefully, folding them into the satchel she carried. The valley seemed different now, less like a graveyard and more like a place of transition. The fire had destroyed, yes, but it had also cleared the way for something new. Whether that something was hope or merely emptiness, Elara could not yet say. As she left the valley, the sky above darkened, stars emerging one by one like hesitant confessions. The air was cooler now, the acrid scent of smoke fading into the crispness of night. The papers in her satchel weighed heavily against her side, a reminder that her journey was far from over. She glanced back once, her eyes tracing the outline of the ruined house against the horizon. It stood like a sentinel, a witness to both destruction and endurance. Elara walked on, her steps steady and purposeful. The ashes whispered beneath her boots, their echoes fading into the vastness of the night. Chapter 3: The Broken Compass. The path was a winding scar across the barren highlands, its stones uneven and sharp, its direction unclear. It seemed less like a road and more like a trail abandoned by its maker, a remnant of a purpose long forgotten. Elara followed it without question, her boots kicking up loose pebbles that clattered down unseen ravines. The weight of the satchel on her back grew heavier with each step, but she pressed on, driven by an invisible pull she couldn't explain. Above her, the sky was a dome of slate, unbroken by sunlight or stars. Clouds hung low, pregnant with rain that refused to fall, casting the landscape in an oppressive gray. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and earth. Time seemed suspended here, the moments stretching into one another until the concept of hours felt meaningless. Elara's legs ached, but the ache was a welcome distraction from the deeper pain that lay coiled within her. In her pocket, the bottle still rested, its weight a constant reminder of the note it had carried. Kale's words had been a compass of sorts, guiding her through the ruins of the valley and now across these desolate highlands. Yet, the more she followed, the less certain she became of what she was seeking. His message was not a map but a riddle, its meaning elusive, its destination unclear. The terrain grew steeper as the path began to climb, the loose stones shifting treacherously underfoot. Elara's breath came in short bursts, her chest tightening with the strain. She paused at the crest of a hill, the ground leveling beneath her for the first time in hours. Before her stretched a plateau, its surface cracked and uneven, marked by the remnants of an ancient cairn. The stones were weathered and discolored, their shapes distorted by time and the elements. She approached the cairn cautiously, her fingers brushing against its rough surface. The stones were cold and damp, their arrangement deliberate yet chaotic, as if built by hands that had forgotten their purpose. Among them, she noticed a faint glimmer, a shard of metal half buried in the earth. She knelt to retrieve it, her fingers prying it free from the soil. It was a compass, or what was left of one. The casing was dented, the glass cracked, its needle frozen at an impossible angle. Elara turned the compass over in her hands, its weight both comforting and disconcerting. It was an artifact of direction, a tool meant to guide, yet it was as broken as she felt. She thought of Kale, of his endless search for something he could never seem to name. The compass might have been his, discarded in frustration or forgotten in haste. Or perhaps it belonged to someone else, another wanderer whose path had crossed these highlands long ago. She slipped the compass into her satchel and rose to her feet. The cairn seemed different now, less like a ruin and more like a waypoint. It marked not an ending but a transition, a place where decisions were made and paths diverged. Elara stared out across the plateau, her gaze tracing the faint outlines of a forest in the distance. The trees were dark and dense, their tops swaying in a wind she could not feel. Beyond them, the land seemed to disappear into the horizon, swallowed by the same gray mist that hung overhead. The forest was not her destination, but it was the only landmark in sight. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and began walking again, her steps measured and deliberate. The plateau was vast, its surface uneven and pocked with shallow pools of water. Each step brought the forest closer, its outline sharpening against the dull sky. Yet, as she approached, the air seemed to change, growing colder and heavier, as if the forest held its own atmosphere. By the time she reached the edge of the trees, the light had faded to a dim twilight, the forest casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like outstretched hands. The ground beneath her feet was soft now, blanketed in a thick layer of fallen leaves and moss. The scent of damp earth was stronger here, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of decay. The trees loomed overhead, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches interwoven like the threads of an ancient tapestry. Elara hesitated at the threshold, her instincts warning her against entering. The forest felt alive in a way that was not comforting but menacing, its silence heavy with unspoken truths. Yet, she could not turn back. The pull that had guided her across the highlands was stronger now, a force that seemed to emanate from deep within the woods. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the soft ground, and the forest swallowed her whole. Inside, the light was dim and fragmented, filtered through the dense canopy above. The air was colder here, carrying a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Elara moved carefully, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes scanning the shadows for signs of danger. The forest was labyrinthine, its paths winding and indistinct, its landmarks elusive. She felt as though she were walking in circles, the trees closing in around her like the bars of a cage. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell. The forest had a way of distorting time, stretching it into something unrecognizable. Elara's limbs grew heavy, her breath shallow, but she pressed on, driven by the same inexplicable pull that had brought her here. She thought of the compass in her satchel, its needle frozen, and wondered if she were any different. Was she, too, moving in circles, chasing something that could never be found? Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint glimmer of light ahead. It was not sunlight, but something softer and more diffuse, as if the forest itself were glowing. She quickened her pace, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a clearing at the heart of the woods. At its center stood a single tree, its trunk silver and smooth, its branches reaching skyward like the spires of a cathedral. Beneath the tree lay a stone altar, its surface etched with markings she could not read. On the altar rested an object she recognized instantly, a journal, its leather cover worn and weathered, its edges frayed from use. Elara approached it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. The journal was warm to the touch, as if it held the remnants of a life still burning within it. She opened it to the first page, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Kale's words leapt from the page, raw and unfiltered, their meaning both clear and elusive. The journal was not a story but a confession, a record of his struggles and failures, his dreams and regrets. It spoke of a journey that mirrored her own, a search for something that could never be named. As she turned the pages, the forest seemed to fade around her, its shadows retreating into the edges of her vision. The journal was a map of emotions, a broken compass pointing not to a destination but to the journey itself. Elara felt the weight of it settle within her, a burden she was both unwilling and unable to relinquish. The forest remained silent as she closed the journal and slipped it into her satchel. The silver tree stood unwavering, its branches reaching toward the sky as if seeking answers from the heavens. Elara looked up, her gaze tracing the path of its limbs, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. The compass was broken, yes, but perhaps it was meant to be. Some paths could not be planned. They could only be followed. Elara turned and began walking again, her steps steady and sure. The forest parted before her, its shadows receding, its silence giving way to the faint rustle of leaves. The pull that had guided her was no longer a mystery. It was her own heart, leading her towards something she could not yet understand. Chapter 4. A Garden Beneath the Frost. The air was sharp with the bite of early winter, its chill seeping into the earth and wrapping itself around everything that dared linger too long. The frost crept like a silent predator, spreading its crystalline tendrils over stones, leaves, and the thin blades of grass that still clung to life. Elara stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath visible in the pale light of dawn. Before her lay the remnants of a garden, its once vibrant beauty now encased in ice. It was not the kind of garden that belonged to a palace or estate. There were no ornate fountains or sculpted hedges. Instead, it was humble, a patchwork of flowers and herbs that had grown wild within their borders. The wooden fencing that once enclosed it had long since decayed, its fragments now scattered among the undergrowth like forgotten memories. The earth beneath the frost was dark and rich, a reminder of the life it had once nurtured. Elara stepped carefully into the garden, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The frost clung to her like a persistent shadow, its cold weight pressing against her skin. She crouched beside a cluster of withered roses, their petals turned brittle and translucent under the icy glaze. Her fingers hovered above them, hesitant to disturb their fragile state. It struck her that even in death, the roses retained a kind of beauty, an echo of what they had been. The journal in her satchel had mentioned this place, though only briefly. Kale's words had painted it in broad strokes, describing it as a sanctuary hidden beneath the veil of seasons. He had written of its vibrancy, its colors, and the solace it offered to those who sought it. Yet now, standing amidst the frost, Elara found it hard to imagine this garden as anything other than what it was, a graveyard of flowers frozen in time. As she explored further, she noticed the remnants of a stone bench half buried beneath a blanket of frost-covered ivy. Its surface was worn smooth by years of exposure, the carvings along its edges barely discernible. She brushed away the frost with her gloved hand, revealing a faint inscription etched into the stone. The words were worn and fragmented, but she could make out enough to understand their intent. For what is lost may yet be found. The phrase lingered in her mind, intertwining with Cale's words from the journal. She wondered if he had sat here, tracing the same inscription with his fingers, pondering its meaning as she now did. It seemed unlikely that he had stumbled upon this place by accident. The garden was hidden deep within the woods, its location known only to those who sought it with purpose. Elara continued her search, her eyes scanning the frost-covered ground for anything that might offer further clues. She found remnants of a small cottage at the edge of the garden, its foundation barely discernible beneath a mound of moss and snow. The walls had long since crumbled, leaving only a hearth standing defiant against the elements. Within the hearth lay a pile of charred wood, blackened and splintered, as if the fire had been snuffed out abruptly. She approached the hearth, drawn to the faint traces of warmth it seemed to hold despite its ruinous state. Among the ashes, she found a small metal box, its surface tarnished and dented. The lid creaked as she pried it open, revealing its contents. A bundle of dried herbs, a handful of faded photographs, and a single key. The photographs were fragile, their edges curling with age, but the images were still discernible, snapshots of a life she did not recognize. One photograph caught her attention. It depicted a man and a woman standing in the garden, their faces obscured by shadows cast by the setting sun. The woman held a basket of flowers, her posture relaxed and content, while the man stood slightly apart, his gaze fixed on something beyond the frame. Elara's heart tightened as she studied the image. There was something familiar about the man, though she couldn't place him. His stance, the set of his shoulders, reminded her of Cale, but it couldn't be him. Or could it? The key was unremarkable, its metal dulled by time, but it felt significant in a way she couldn't explain. She slipped it into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the bottle and the broken compass. Her satchel was becoming a repository of fragments, a collection of mysteries she was no closer to solving. The weight of it was both physical and emotional, a reminder of how far she had come and how far she had yet to go. As the sun climbed higher, its weak rays began to melt the frost, revealing glimpses of the garden's true nature beneath the icy veneer. Colors emerged tentatively, the green of moss, the deep brown of the soil, and the faint blush of a single surviving bloom. Elara knelt beside it, her breath catching as she realized what it was. A violet, its petals trembling in the cold breeze. It was small, almost insignificant, but it had endured where so much else had withered. She reached out to touch the flower, her fingers brushing against its delicate surface. In that moment, she felt a surge of something she couldn't name. Hope, perhaps, or determination. The garden was not dead, not entirely. Beneath the frost, beneath the weight of winter, life still lingered. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, some things endured. Elara stood, the violet's image etched into her mind, and turned back toward the woods. The garden was behind her now, but its essence clung to her like the frost. She carried the metal box and its contents, the photographs and the key, as she made her way back into the shadows of the forest. The path ahead was uncertain, as it always had been, but she walked it with a newfound resolve. The frost lingered in the air, its bite a constant companion, but Elara no longer felt its weight. She had found something in the garden, something small, fragile, and fleeting, but enough to keep her moving forward. Beneath the frost, there was still a garden. Beneath her doubt, there was still a purpose. Chapter 5. Shadows We Cannot Hold. The sound of running water reached Elara long before she saw the river. It was a gentle murmur at first, soft and distant, as if the earth itself whispered secrets to the wind. The forest thinned as she followed the sound, the dense canopy giving way to patches of open sky. The sun had climbed higher now, its light casting long shadows over the undergrowth, dappling the ground in gold and green. Yet, the air remained cool, the memory of frost lingering like a ghost. When the river came into view, it was not as she had imagined. Its waters were not clear but dark, their surface rippling with a strange iridescence that seemed to shimmer in defiance of the light. The river wound its way through the valley like a serpent, its path twisting and unpredictable. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if its waters carried more than just the current. Elara stood at its edge, her reflection wavering in the dark mirror before her, and felt an unspoken unease. The journal had mentioned a river, though its description had been vague, just a single line scrawled in Kale's uneven hand. A river that flows backward carries the truth of all things. Elara had puzzled over those words for days, their meaning elusive, their implications unsettling. Now, as she gazed upon the river's dark waters, she wondered if Kale had stood here, too, his thoughts as tangled as hers. She crouched at the riverbank, her fingers brushing against the smooth stones that lined the shore. They were slick with moss, their surfaces cool and damp. Among them, she found fragments of broken pottery, small shards painted with faded patterns of blue and white. She turned them over in her hand, trying to piece them together like the fragments of a larger story. The shards seemed ancient, their edges worn smooth by time and water, but they carried an unmistakable human touch. Someone had crafted them, used them, and then left them here to be forgotten. The river called to her in its own way, its murmurs growing louder as if beckoning her closer. She removed her boots and stepped into the water, her breath catching at the shock of its cold embrace. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging at her legs as if trying to pull her downstream. Yet, the river's flow felt strange, almost contradictory. The surface moved forward, but the undercurrent seemed to drag backward, pulling at her feet with an insistent force. Elara waded deeper, the water rising to her knees, then her thighs. The satchel at her side swayed precariously, its weight a reminder of all she carried. She clutched it tightly, unwilling to let it slip beneath the surface. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one an act of defiance against the river's pull. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she needed to press on. As she moved further from the shore, the river's murmur grew into a low roar. The water darkened around her, its iridescent sheen intensifying until it seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The shards of pottery at the bottom multiplied, their patterns overlapping in a chaotic mosaic. Among them, she spotted other objects, a rusted blade, a tarnished coin, the skeletal remains of a small bird. The river, it seemed, was a collector of lost things. Her gaze fell upon a larger shape resting on the riverbed, half buried in silt. It was the outline of a chest, its wooden frame splintered and decayed but still intact. Elara hesitated, her pulse quickening as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed against the wood, its texture rough and splintered, and she felt a jolt of something she couldn't explain. A recognition, perhaps, or a memory she couldn't quite grasp. The chest was heavier than she anticipated, its weight resisting her efforts to lift it. She dug her heels into the riverbed, the current pushing against her as she struggled to pull it free. The effort drained her, each movement a battle against the water's relentless pull. At last, the chest broke free with a dull groan, its contents shifting audibly as it rose to the surface. Elara dragged it toward the shore, her arms trembling with the effort, and collapsed onto the riverbank, her chest heaving with exertion. The chest was old, its wood darkened by water and time, its hinges corroded beyond recognition. Elara knelt beside it, her hands steady despite the cold. She pried it open with a sharp rock, the lid creaking in protest as it gave way. Inside, she found a collection of objects, each one wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the water. She unwrapped them carefully, her fingers trembling as she revealed their contents. The first item was a book, its leather cover warped but its pages surprisingly intact. The handwriting inside was not Kale's but someone else's, the script flowing and elegant. The words were a mix of poetry and observation, their tone wistful and melancholic. They spoke of the river, its mysteries and its contradictions, and of the people who had once lived along its banks. The second item was a carved wooden figure, small enough to fit in her palm. It depicted a bird in flight, its wings outstretched, its beak open in a silent cry. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each feather rendered with painstaking detail. Elara turned it over, her thumb brushing against an inscription carved into its base. To soar is to dream. The final item was a locket, its surface tarnished and worn but still intact. Inside was a photograph, the image faded and blurred but unmistakably familiar. It showed a young man and woman standing beside the river, their faces turned toward the camera in expressions of quiet joy. The man bore a striking resemblance to Kale, though younger and more carefree. The woman's features were softer, her gaze serene, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Elara stared at the photograph, her heart pounding in her chest. The discovery felt like a revelation and a betrayal all at once. Kale had been here, there was no doubt now, and he had not been alone. The river had held his secrets, its backward flow carrying the fragments of his past to this moment. She slipped the locket into her pocket and closed the chest, leaving the other items undisturbed. The river's murmur had quieted now, its pull less insistent. Elara stood at the edge of the water, her gaze fixed on its dark surface. She thought of the journal, the garden, the broken compass, and now the locket. Each piece felt like a fragment of a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. The river flowed onward, its current carrying away the frost and the shards of pottery, the broken and the lost. Elara turned away, her steps heavy but purposeful. She left the river behind, its secrets weighing on her heart, and walked toward the horizon, where the forest thinned and the land opened wide. The river's backward flow lingered in her mind, a question without an answer. She pressed forward, her journey far from over, the truth still elusive but closer than it had ever been. Chapter 6. The Weight of Empty Promises. The valley lay shrouded in mist. A silver veil draped over the landscape that softened its edges and blurred its depths. Elara moved cautiously through the haze, her every step muffled by the damp earth beneath her boots. The world here felt muted, as though sound and light had been swallowed by the mist, leaving only a faint echo of reality. The air was thick with moisture, clinging to her skin and hair, chilling her despite the layers she wore. She had followed the river until its course veered sharply into a gorge, its waters vanishing into a chasm of jagged rock. From there, the land had opened into this valley, its boundaries obscured by the ever-present mist. The journal had offered no mention of this place, no words to guide her or warn her of what she might find. Yet, something about the valley felt significant, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The mist was deceptive, playing tricks on her eyes. Shapes loomed in the distance, shifting and disappearing as she approached, their forms as insubstantial as the vapor that surrounded her. Trees emerged from the fog like specters, their gnarled branches reaching skyward in twisted, desperate gestures. The ground was uneven, punctuated by shallow depressions filled with stagnant water that reflected the gray sky above. Elara avoided these pools, uneasy at the thought of what might lie beneath their surfaces. The satchel at her side felt heavier with each passing hour, its contents a growing burden she could not set down. The locket she had found at the river seemed to burn against her side, its presence a constant reminder of the photograph it contained. She had studied the image countless times since discovering it, her mind spinning with questions. Who was the woman? What was her connection to Kale? And why had he left the locket behind, abandoned to the river's backward flow? As she ventured deeper into the valley, the mist began to shift, swirling around her in patterns that felt deliberate. The air grew colder, the ground harder beneath her feet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the trees. It was a silence that pressed against her, amplifying her thoughts until they felt deafening. She stopped abruptly, her gaze caught by a faint glimmer ahead. It was a flicker of light, faint and erratic, as if reflected off glass. Elara moved toward it, her pulse quickening despite the unease that churned in her stomach. The light grew brighter as she approached, resolving into the unmistakable sheen of water. A lake emerged from the mist, its surface still and dark, its edges fading into the fog like the borders of a dream. The lake was a mirror, its waters so smooth they reflected the world around it with eerie precision. Elara knelt at its edge, her own image staring back at her from the depths. Her reflection was distorted, the mist twisting her features into something unrecognizable. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface, and watched as ripples spread outward, shattering the image into fragments. The ripples revealed something beneath the surface, shapes that should not have been there. They were faint at first, ghostly outlines that grew sharper as the water stilled. Elara leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. The shapes resolved into structures, the jagged edges of ruined towers, the broken arches of a long-submerged bridge, the crumbling remnants of a city drowned beneath the lake. The sight was both haunting and mesmerizing. The city seemed ancient, its architecture unlike anything Elara had ever seen. The buildings were angular and imposing, their facades etched with intricate designs that glimmered faintly in the dim light. She felt a pang of longing as she gazed upon the ruins, a sense of connection she couldn't explain. It was as if the city had been waiting for her, its secrets buried beneath the water, its story entwined with her own. Elara stood and began walking along the lake's edge, her eyes scanning the water for further signs of the city below. The mist thickened as she moved, swallowing her steps and obscuring her path. She felt as though she were walking in circles, the lake stretching endlessly before her, its shores offering no clues, no answers. Her thoughts turned to the objects she carried, the journal, the compass, the locket. Each one felt like a thread, tangled and frayed, leading her deeper into this mystery. She reached for the locket, her fingers brushing against its cold surface, and opened it once more. The photograph stared back at her, the faces of the man and woman frozen in time, their expressions serene yet enigmatic. As she studied the image, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the background, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of the lake. The towers of the drowned city were visible too, their jagged forms rising from the water like broken teeth. The realization hit her like a blow. Kale had been here. He had stood on these shores, gazed upon this lake, and left behind this fragment of his journey. The mist around her seemed to thicken, pressing in closer, wrapping her in its cold embrace. Elara closed the locket and slipped it back into her pocket, her resolve hardening. The city beneath the lake held answers, she was sure of it. But how could she reach it? The water was dark and uninviting, its depths unknowable. She thought of the compass, its needle frozen, and wondered if it might guide her even in its broken state. As she pondered her next move, the mist parted briefly, revealing a small island at the center of the lake. It was a jagged outcrop of stone, its surface barren except for a single tree that stood at its peak. The tree was unlike any she had seen before. its trunk blackened and twisted, its branches bare but for a single, glowing fruit that hung like a star against the gray sky. The sight filled her with both wonder and trepidation. The island felt important, its presence a beacon in the mist, but it was also isolated, unreachable. The lake's waters were calm but deceptive, their surface hiding untold dangers. Elara hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. The island was her next destination. She was certain of that, but the path to it was unclear. The mist swirled around her once more, obscuring the island, the lake, and everything beyond her immediate reach. Elara stood at the water's edge, her reflection fractured and shifting in the ripples. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she knew she could not turn back. The lake held its secrets close, its mirrored surface a barrier she would have to cross. With a deep breath, she tightened her grip on her satchel and took her first step into the unknown. Chapter 7. Threads of a Silent Loom. The island rose from the lake like a sentinel, its jagged stone edges defying the smooth surface of the water. Elara stood at the shoreline, her boots half submerged in the icy lake, staring at the path before her. It was not a path in any traditional sense. There was no bridge, no boat, no discernible way to cross the dark expanse of water that separated her from the island. Yet, the pull toward it was undeniable, an invisible force that tugged at her very core. The mist around her had thickened, its tendrils curling through the air like living things, brushing against her skin and leaving behind a damp chill. The air felt heavy, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but charged, filled with the weight of things unspoken. The only sound was the faint lapping of the water against the rocks, a rhythm as steady as her heartbeat. She removed her satchel, placing it on the ground with care. One by one, she pulled out the items she had collected so far. The locket, the broken compass, the journal, and the small vial of liquid she had found in the hidden drawer back in the cabin. Each object seemed to hum with its own energy, their collective presence a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. Her fingers lingered on the compass, its cracked glass glinting faintly in the diffuse light. The needle remained still, its north forever lost. Yet she felt as though it pointed somewhere important. Elara held the compass in her hand, turning it over and over, its weight solid and comforting. The thought struck her that it was not the compass that was broken, but her understanding of it. Perhaps its purpose was not to guide her to familiar destinations, but to places unknown, places that existed only at the edges of maps and imagination. She closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythm of her breath, and allowed herself to listen. Not with her ears, but with some deeper sense. When she opened her eyes, the mist seemed to part ever so slightly, revealing a faint shimmer on the water's surface. It was subtle, barely visible, like the glint of moonlight on still water, though no moon hung in the sky. Elara stepped closer, her boots sinking into the soft mud at the lake's edge. The shimmer grew stronger, stretching out before her in a thin, winding line that led directly to the island. She hesitated, her mind torn between instinct and logic. The shimmer was too precise, too deliberate to be natural. It beckoned her, promising safe passage, but there was an unnatural quality to it that set her on edge. Yet, what choice did she have? The island was her destination, and the path, however uncertain, was the only way forward. Elara stepped onto the shimmer, half expecting her foot to sink into the water. Instead, the surface beneath her held firm, solid yet yielding, like glass coated in frost. The sensation was disconcerting, the faint give beneath her weight making her heart race. She took another step, then another, each one more confident than the last. The shimmer stretched out before her, a fragile bridge suspended between worlds. The mist closed in around her as she walked, the island growing closer with each step. The air was colder here, the chill biting through her coat and settling deep into her bones. The silence deepened, pressing against her like a physical weight. Her footsteps made no sound, as though the shimmer absorbed all traces of her presence. She felt as though she were walking through a dream, each step taking her further from reality. When she reached the island, the shimmer dissolved beneath her, leaving no trace of the path she had taken. The ground beneath her feet was rough and uneven, a stark contrast to the smooth surface of the lake. The island was small, its boundaries defined by jagged rocks and the twisted remains of trees long since dead. At its center stood the blackened tree she had seen from the shore, its branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. The fruit hanging from the tree was unlike anything Elara had ever seen. It glowed softly, a pale golden light that pulsed faintly as though alive. It was small, no larger than her fist, and perfectly round, its surface smooth and unmarred. The light it emitted was gentle, warm even, a stark contrast to the cold, desolate landscape around it. Elara approached the tree cautiously, her every sense on edge. The air here was different, heavier, as though the very atmosphere was thick with unseen forces. The tree's bark was dark and brittle, its surface etched with patterns that seemed both organic and deliberate. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the rough surface. A jolt of energy coursed through her, not painful but startling, a reminder that this place was not like any other. The fruit seemed to respond to her presence, its glow intensifying as she drew closer. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze to move it, as if acknowledging her approach. Elara hesitated, her hand hovering just inches away. She felt a deep sense of unease, as though crossing this threshold would set into motion events she could not undo. Yet, the pull toward the fruit was irresistible, a compulsion that defied logic. She plucked the fruit from the branch, its stem snapping with a soft sound that seemed to echo in the silence. The moment it left the tree, the light within it dimmed, shifting from gold to a faint, silvery glow. Elara cradled it in her hands, its surface warm against her skin. The tree shuddered as if in protest, its branches trembling before falling still once more. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a low rumble that grew steadily stronger. The island itself seemed to shift, its rocks groaning as cracks spread across its surface. The lake roared to life, its still waters churning violently, waves crashing against the island's edges. The mist thickened, swirling in chaotic patterns that obscured her vision. Elara stumbled, clutching the fruit tightly, as the world around her seemed to collapse. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The island fell silent once more, the lake's surface smoothing out until it was as still as glass. The mist parted, revealing a clear view of the mainland. The shimmering path was gone, but the way forward was unmistakable. Elara stood at the edge of the island, the fruit still glowing faintly in her hands. The weight of silence returned, heavier than ever, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it carried a sense of purpose, a promise that the answers she sought were closer than ever. With one last glance at the blackened tree, she turned and stepped into the lake, the cold water rising around her as she began the long journey back to the shore. The fruit's light guided her, a fragile beacon in the endless mist. Chapter 8. The Moon's Last Witness. The fruit's faint, silvery glow flickered like a dying ember as Elara emerged from the lake. The water clung to her, heavy and cold, chilling her to the marrow. Her breaths came in sharp bursts, each one visible in the frigid air, as though the lake had stolen the warmth from her lungs. The shoreline welcomed her in its own desolate way, the muddy ground swallowing her boots with each step until she collapsed onto the earth, exhausted. For a moment, she simply lay there, her back pressed against the damp ground, the gray sky looming above her. The mist had thinned slightly, revealing patches of the valley she hadn't noticed before. The barren trees still stood like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the air, but there were also mounds scattered across the landscape. Low, rounded shapes that looked unnervingly deliberate. The silence, ever-present and suffocating, pressed down on her once more. Elara sat up slowly, clutching the fruit in her hands. Its glow was weaker now, pulsing faintly as if struggling to stay alive. She turned it over, studying its surface. It was smooth and warm, though its light felt cold, a contradiction that made her uneasy. There were no markings, no indication of its purpose or why it had been hidden away on that desolate island. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fruit was important, a key, perhaps, or a message left for her to decipher. Her satchel lay where she had left it, its contents undisturbed. She placed the fruit inside, its glow barely visible through the worn fabric, and pulled the strap over her shoulder. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried not just the fruit, but the gravity of the choices she had yet to make. She scanned the valley, her eyes drawn to the mounds scattered across the landscape. They were too symmetrical to be natural, their rounded shapes rising from the earth like ancient graves. A chill ran through her as she considered the possibility. The journal had mentioned nothing of this place, no hints or warnings about what she might find here. Yet, the mounds seemed to demand her attention, their silent presence impossible to ignore. Elara approached the nearest mound cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate. The ground grew firmer as she neared, the mud giving way to dry, cracked earth. The mound itself was covered in a thin layer of ash, its surface smooth and undisturbed. She crouched beside it, brushing away the ash with her gloved hand, revealing a dark, glassy material beneath. It glinted faintly in the weak light, its surface etched with strange, angular patterns that seemed both geometric and organic. The patterns were mesmerizing, their lines and shapes intertwining in ways that felt deliberate, as though they formed a language she couldn't quite read. Elara traced them with her fingers, the glassy surface cool and smooth beneath her touch. As she studied the patterns, a strange sensation washed over her, a feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes observing her every move. She turned sharply, her heart racing, but the valley was as empty as ever. The barren trees stood motionless, the mist swirling gently around them. Yet, the sensation persisted, an unshakable awareness of another presence. Elara straightened, her hand instinctively reaching for the compass in her pocket. The broken device offered no guidance, its needle frozen as always, but the act of holding it brought her a small measure of comfort. She moved to another mound, then another, her unease growing with each one she examined. They were all the same, covered in ash, their surfaces etched with those enigmatic patterns. Some were larger than others, their shapes more defined, but all of them carried the same haunting stillness, as though they were waiting for something, or someone. At the fifth mound, she found something different. The ash here was thicker, darker, its texture gritty and coarse. As she brushed it away, her fingers caught on something jagged, a sharp edge that jutted out from the glassy surface beneath. She cleared more of the ash, revealing what appeared to be the remains of a blade, its metal rusted and pitted with age. The hilt was embedded in the mound, its grip wrapped in a material that had long since decayed. Elara stared at the blade, her mind racing with questions. The sight of it filled her with a sense of dread, as though it carried the weight of a long-forgotten violence. She imagined the hand that had wielded it, the lives it might have taken, and the events that had led to its burial here. The patterns on the mound seemed to radiate outward from the blade, their lines converging around it like the ripples of a stone dropped into water. The fruit in her satchel pulsed faintly, its light flickering through the fabric. Elara reached for it, her fingers brushing against its surface, and felt a surge of energy course through her. The patterns on the mound seemed to respond, their lines glowing faintly, their shapes shifting ever so slightly. The sensation was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to confirm what she had suspected. The fruit and the mounds were connected. Elara stood, her gaze sweeping across the valley. The mounds stretched out in every direction, their silent presence overwhelming. She felt a growing urgency, a need to understand their purpose and what they meant for her journey. The journal, the compass, the locket, the fruit. They were all pieces of a puzzle she had yet to solve, a story written in fragments and buried beneath the surface. The weight of silence pressed down on her once more, heavier than ever. Elara took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she couldn't stop now. The valley, the mounds, the glowing fruit. They were all part of something larger, something she was destined to uncover. With the fruit pulsing faintly in her satchel, Elara turned her gaze toward the horizon. The mists were beginning to lift, revealing a distant ridge that marked the edge of the valley. Beyond it lay the unknown, a path shrouded in uncertainty but filled with possibility. She tightened her grip on the compass, its broken needle pointing nowhere and everywhere at once, and took her first step toward whatever lay ahead. Chapter 9. Falling Without Wings. The mist, though thinner than it had been, still clung to the landscape like a shroud. It wound around the trees, twining through their gnarled branches in languid coils, as though the very air was reluctant to let go of the valley's secrets. Elara stood at the base of the ridge, her eyes tracing its outline against the ashen sky. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, its rocky surface betraying the long erosion of time. Still, she felt drawn forward, compelled by some force she couldn't name, a pull that had guided her since the moment she set foot in this forsaken place. The mounds behind her seemed to recede into the distance, their silent forms vanishing into the fog. The valley was behind her now, and with it, the growing uncertainty that had gnawed at her for so long. The island, the fruit, the blade. These were now but fragments in the wake of something greater, something she had yet to comprehend. As Elara ascended the ridge, her boots scraping against the loose earth, the air grew cooler, sharper. The mist, though still present, seemed more alive here, swirling around her with an unnatural energy. It tugged at her hair and brushed against her skin like 1,000 unseen fingers. She could feel the weight of the world pressing against her, as though the very atmosphere were alive with intent, suffused with a purpose that called to her. There was something about the ridge that felt ancient, older than the land itself, as though it had borne witness to countless stories, all of them forgotten by time. Elara reached out a hand to steady herself as she climbed higher, the stones beneath her hands cold and smooth, worn by centuries of weather and wear. The air had a strange stillness to it, as though the land held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The ascent was slow and laborious. The ridge was jagged, its rocks uneven and treacherous, but with each step, Elara's resolve solidified. She had no clear path, no map to guide her, but she had an instinct, something deep within her that told her to keep going, to keep moving forward. The valley was now behind her, but ahead of her, the mist seemed to part just slightly, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond. When she reached the crest of the ridge, she paused for a moment, her breath catching in her chest as she looked out over what stretched before her. The land was vast, undulating, but there was no mistaking what she saw. A shadow, a dark form in the distance, looming against the pale sky. It was not a mountain, nor a natural feature of the land. It was a structure, something built, something old. The silhouette was imposing, its jagged outline cutting into the sky like a ruinous spire. Her heart quickened as she stood there, transfixed by the sight. It was a city, or what was left of one. Elara's pulse raced as the reality of what she was seeing began to settle into her bones. She had felt it, the pull toward the island, the fruit, the mounds. But now, standing on the ridge, staring at the decaying remains of a city, she understood. This was her destination. This was where it had all been leading her. The city stood against the horizon like a monument to forgotten things. Its towers, once grand and towering, were now skeletal remains, their tops broken and jagged, their walls crumbling into the earth. The streets that had once been proud and bustling were now lost beneath layers of dust and time, their stones swallowed by the relentless march of decay. But still, there was something about it, something alive in its ruin. It beckoned her, whispered promises in the wind, though what those promises were, she could not yet say. Elara took a deep breath, the mist swirling around her, thickening as if in response to her decision. There was no turning back. She had come too far, and something in her knew that the city, or what remained of it, held the answers she had been searching for. The descent from the ridge was steep, the ground crumbling beneath her feet as she made her way down. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around her as if it sought to delay her journey, to hold her in place, but she pressed on, each step taking her closer to the city. As she moved closer, the city began to reveal itself more fully, its broken silhouette growing larger with each step. The towers seemed to lean in toward her, their shattered edges gleaming like jagged teeth in the dim light. She reached the base of the hill, where the remains of a road stretched out before her. It was cracked and overgrown with weeds, its edges crumbling. But it was still a road, still a path leading toward the heart of the city. Elara followed it, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the only sound the soft crunch of earth beneath her boots. As she walked, her mind raced, questions tumbling over each other. What had happened to the city? Who had lived here? And why had it been abandoned? The mounds in the valley, the blade she had uncovered. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one she could not yet see clearly. There was a connection between this place, the fruit, and the journal, but how did they fit together? And what role did she play in all of it? The road twisted and turned as it led her deeper into the city. The buildings around her were in various states of ruin, some collapsed entirely, others standing half destroyed. Yet, there was a strange beauty to the decay, a haunting elegance in the way the structures leaned and buckled under the weight of time. As Elara walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking through someone else's dream, through a history that was no longer her own, but one that had a deep resonance with her. She came to a wide, open plaza, its center marked by the remains of what had once been a grand fountain. The stone was cracked, the water long since drained, but the shape of the fountain was still visible, as if it had been frozen in time. At the far end of the plaza stood a massive structure, its doors carved with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with a forgotten energy. The doorway was wide open, its dark interior beckoning her forward. The air around the doorway seemed different, charged with an electric tension that set her on edge. The fruit in her satchel pulsed again, a faint rhythm that matched her quickening heartbeat. The city had been waiting for her. This she knew in her bones. The answers she sought, the truth she had been chasing for so long, lay beyond that door. Elara hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. The weight of the silence around her was absolute, but she pressed on, her footsteps echoing through the plaza as she moved closer to the entrance. Each step felt heavy with significance, the threshold before her marking the point of no return. Chapter 10. Scars Beneath the Petals. The door closed behind her with a soft, reverberating thud that seemed to swallow the world outside. Elara stood in the dim interior, the air heavy with the scent of ancient dust and the lingering trace of something unknown. The darkness enveloped her, the faint glow of the fruit in her satchel casting weak shadows on the stone walls. She could barely make out the contours of the room, the details obscured by the thick atmosphere that hung in the air like a weight, as though the very space was holding its breath. Her senses heightened in the silence, every breath, every rustle of her cloak amplified in the stillness. The stone beneath her boots was cold, its surface slick with moisture, as if the very walls themselves had absorbed the years of forgotten history. She could feel the weight of time pressing in on her, a palpable force, as if the building itself had grown tired, worn down by centuries of neglect and decay. Yet, there was something in the air, an energy that hummed softly, just beneath the surface, like a pulse waiting to be discovered. Elara took a tentative step forward, her hand instinctively reaching out to brush the walls for guidance. The stone was smooth, polished by the passing years, but beneath her fingers, she could sense faint impressions, carvings barely discernible in the darkness. They seemed to form patterns, lines that twisted and turned, as if they were meant to be read. But the images were too faded, too worn to make sense of. With her heart pounding in her chest, Elara continued to move deeper into the space, her senses straining to understand what lay ahead. The air grew colder with each step, the chill creeping into her bones, and yet there was no wind, no movement of air to explain it. It was as if the room itself was breathing, exhaling in time with her own labored breaths. The farther she ventured, the more oppressive the silence became, as though the shadows were alive, watching her every move. In the distance, she could make out the faintest trace of light, a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to beckon her forward. It was weak at first, like a flicker from a dying flame, but as she approached, the glow grew stronger, more defined, until she could see it clearly. A large, circular pool at the center of the room. The surface of the pool shimmered with an eerie, iridescent light, casting reflections that danced and rippled across the walls, distorting the space around her. Elara stood at the edge of the pool, mesmerized by its glow. The water was dark, its depths hidden from view, but there was a sense of movement beneath the surface, a subtle shifting, as though something was stirring in the depths, something that had been waiting for her to arrive. The light seemed to pulse with a rhythm, synchronized with her heartbeat, as if the very essence of the room had recognized her presence. She knelt at the edge, her fingers brushing the surface of the water. The coldness of it sent a shock through her, but she did not pull away. Instead, she felt a strange connection to the pool, as though it was calling her, drawing her in. Her reflection rippled in the water, distorted by the movement beneath the surface, and yet, something was different about it. The face staring back at her was not quite her own. It was a version of herself, but older, weathered, as though she had lived through a lifetime of sorrow and loss. The eyes that stared back at her were not the eyes she recognized, but those of someone else, someone who had seen too much. A chill ran through her spine, but she could not look away. The reflection seemed to shift, as if it were not a reflection at all, but a window into another world, another time. The surface of the water rippled again, and Elara felt a sharp tug within her chest, as if something had awakened within her, something ancient, something long forgotten. Her breath caught in her throat as the water began to churn. The glow from the pool grew brighter, its light intensifying, casting strange shadows on the walls that seemed to pulse in time with the water's movement. The sensation of being watched, of being drawn towards something beyond her understanding, intensified with each passing second. It was as though the room itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Elara stood slowly, her hands trembling as she took a step back from the pool. She had seen this before. The strange, shifting reflection, the pull that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. It was the same feeling she had experienced on the island, when she had first found the fruit, when the mounds had called to her. There was a connection between all of this, a thread that tied the pool, the fruit, and the ruins together in a way she could not yet understand. The air grew heavier still, thick with the sense of something imminent. Elara turned away from the pool, her gaze scanning the room for any sign of what she was meant to do next. The walls, though bare of decoration, seemed to be watching her, their smooth surfaces reflecting the faint glow of the pool in strange, distorted angles. The room was large, but its confines felt crushing, as though the weight of the past were pressing in on her from all sides. Then, her eyes caught something else, a door, far across the room, partially open, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. The light from the pool flickered against its frame, casting eerie shadows that stretched across the stone floor like reaching fingers. Elara hesitated for a moment, the pull toward the hallway undeniable, but the thought of leaving the pool behind filled her with a strange unease. With a deep breath, she turned away from the pool, her heart pounding as she moved toward the doorway. Each step seemed to echo in the vast, empty space, the silence wrapping around her like a cloak. The hallway beyond was narrow, its walls covered in the same faded, worn carvings as the ones she had touched earlier. The air here was colder still, the darkness pressing in tighter, and the sense of something ancient, something hidden, was almost suffocating. Elara moved cautiously through the corridor, her eyes straining to catch any details in the dim light. The walls seemed to close in around her as she walked, and the path twisted, curving sharply until she could no longer see the pool behind her. The light from the room seemed to fade as well, leaving her in a thick, almost tangible darkness. But still, she pressed on, the sense that she was nearing something crucial growing stronger with each step. At the end of the hallway, the path opened into another chamber, this one even larger than the room she had just left. It was a cavernous space, its ceilings lost in shadow, but at its center stood something unmistakable. A large, obsidian obelisk rose from the center of the room, its surface reflecting the faint glow of the fruit in her satchel. Strange symbols were etched into its sides, their shapes as unfamiliar as the carvings on the walls. They twisted and turned, too complex to decipher, but there was no mistaking the sense of power that radiated from the obelisk. The fruit in her satchel pulsed again, its glow growing brighter, and Elara felt the call once more. There was no turning back now. She had come too far, and whatever was about to unfold, whatever secret the obelisk held, was the final piece of the puzzle. Elara approached the obelisk slowly, the weight of the room pressing down on her. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and the air grew thick with anticipation. As she reached out to touch the surface of the obelisk, she felt a jolt of energy shoot through her, a surge of power that left her breathless. The symbols on the obelisk shifted beneath her fingers, their shapes beginning to glow, casting an eerie, ethereal light across the room. The glow from the fruit in her satchel flared brightly in response, and Elara knew, with an absolute certainty, that the moment had come. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The fruit, the pool, the obelisk, it was all connected. And now, there was nothing left to do but wait, to listen, and to understand. Chapter 11. A Horizon Left Unseen. The stillness in the chamber grew thicker, the air dense with an ancient, unspoken weight that threatened to suffocate her. Elara's hand still rested against the obsidian obelisk, the strange symbols beneath her fingertips pulsing in rhythm with her own heartbeat, a pulse so strong she thought it might consume her. The fruit in her satchel, now glowing with an intensity she had not thought possible, seemed to hum in response, its vibrations a quiet echo that resonated deep within her chest. For a moment, the room seemed to bend, the walls distorting as if the very space itself was stretching and warping around her. The light from the obelisk illuminated the symbols, casting long shadows on the walls, shadows that shifted and danced like living things. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as though the chamber, the obelisk, the entire forgotten city, was no longer passive. It was alive, aware of her presence, and it was waiting. The fruit's glow was becoming almost blinding now, casting a strange, otherworldly light that bathed the room in an eerie, ethereal hue. Elara's fingers tingled as they continued to trace the symbols, and she felt a deep connection to them, a link she could not explain. They were not just shapes, not just marks left by some forgotten hand. They were a language that spoke directly to something buried within her, a deep, ancient memory, perhaps, or a longing for something lost. She had seen these symbols before, on the walls of the ruined city, in the mists that had surrounded the island, on the blade that had called to her. They were everywhere, in fragments, in pieces, and now, as she stood before the obelisk, it felt as though they were coming together, forming a map, a path, a story that was beginning to unfold around her. The glow from the obelisk intensified, and the air around her seemed to tremble. The symbols beneath her fingers began to move, shifting and reconfiguring, their shapes warping in fluid, almost hypnotic motions. Elara could feel the energy building, coiling around her like a force of nature, a wave she could neither control nor escape. And then, as suddenly as the energy had gathered, it erupted. A burst of light flooded the room, the glow from the obelisk consuming everything around her. Elara staggered back, her breath caught in her throat as the light seemed to collapse inward, pulling her into its center. The symbols on the obelisk spun faster, until they were a blur, a vortex of energy pulling her deeper into the heart of the chamber. She could hear a sound now, a low, resonant hum that reverberated through her very bones, vibrating through her chest, through her head, through her soul. And then, just as quickly as the eruption had come, it stopped. The light faded, leaving Elara standing in the center of the chamber, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The symbols on the obelisk had vanished, as if they had never existed, leaving only a smooth, featureless surface behind. The room was silent again, but now the silence felt different, heavy with meaning, as though the very air was filled with the weight of what had just transpired. Elara's hand dropped from the obelisk, the pulse of energy fading from her fingertips. She stood there for a long moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The glow from the fruit in her satchel had dimmed, but she could still feel its presence, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to mirror her own. Her mind raced, questions swirling through her thoughts like a storm. What had she just witnessed? What had she awakened? She looked around the chamber, her eyes scanning the space for any sign, any clue that could shed light on what she had just experienced. But the room was still, empty, unchanged. The obelisk no longer hummed with energy, no longer thrummed with the same intensity. Everything had returned to its original state, as though nothing had happened at all. But Elara knew better. She could feel it, deep in her core. Something had shifted. Something had been set in motion. She glanced down at the fruit. It still pulsed softly, its glow now muted, but the rhythm was steady, constant. The connection between the fruit and the obelisk, between the pool and the ruins, was clearer than ever before. She had awakened something, some force, some forgotten power that lay dormant in this place for eons. But what had it all been leading to? What had she done? A sudden movement caught her eye, and she froze, her body tensing. At first, she thought it was the light, some trick of the shadows or the fruit's glow, but then she saw it again. A shape, a silhouette standing in the doorway at the far end of the chamber. It was tall, elongated, its form barely discernible in the shadows, but the presence was undeniable. She could feel it, as if the very air around her had shifted to accommodate this new being, this new presence. For a moment, Elara didn't move, her heart racing, her mind scrambling to process what she was seeing. The figure did not move, did not speak, but its presence seemed to press in on her from all sides. She could feel the weight of it, a force that was both familiar and foreign, a presence that felt like a memory she could not quite reach. The fruit in her satchel pulsed again, its rhythm steady and insistent. She instinctively reached for it, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the fabric as she felt a strange, overwhelming compulsion to approach the figure. It was as if the room itself was guiding her, pushing her toward this unknown presence. And yet, a part of her resisted. A part of her understood that whatever lay ahead was not something she was ready for. But there was no choice. The path had already been set in motion. She could feel the inexorable pull of fate, a current that carried her forward despite her hesitation. With a deep breath, Elara took a step toward the figure. As she moved, the shadows seemed to shift, to part in front of her, revealing more of the figure's outline. The shape grew clearer with each passing moment, and the closer she came, the more the air seemed to thrum with energy, with anticipation. When she finally stood before the figure, she saw it clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body draped in flowing robes of dark fabric that seemed to absorb the light, making it difficult to discern its true shape. The face, though obscured by a hood, was unmistakable. The eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, were ancient and knowing, filled with an understanding that transcended time. There was no mistaking it now. This was no ordinary being. The figure raised one hand, slow and deliberate, and in that motion, Elara felt the very air around her shift, as though the balance of the room, the world itself, was being altered by this single gesture. A voice, though silent, filled her mind, and she understood. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The time for questions had passed. It was time to face what she had awakened, time to face what lay ahead. The still heart of the chamber had begun to beat again, and with it, the echoes of forgotten souls, the long-dormant forces of this place, had begun to stir. Chapter 12. The Choice of Stars. The chamber was silent once more, but this silence was different, heavy, as if the very air was brimming with the energy of what had been set in motion. Elara stood before the figure, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. The figure remained still, but it exuded an unmistakable presence, a weight that seemed to shift the atmosphere around her, as though the laws of space and time themselves had bent to accommodate this ancient force. There was no voice, no sound, only the quiet, persistent hum of the world holding its breath, waiting. In that suffocating stillness, Elara felt herself unraveling, the threads of her understanding and her own existence being slowly pulled apart. She was no longer sure where the chamber ended and she began. Her senses were flooded with a thousand impressions, flashes of distant places, memories that did not belong to her, whispers that seemed to echo through the very stone of the ruins. The glow from the fruit had dimmed entirely, and yet she could still feel it, its pulse steady beneath her skin, as if it had taken root inside her. The familiar rhythm was now synchronized with her heartbeat, an echo that vibrated through her every bone, every fiber of her being. It was as if the fruit, the obelisk, the ruins themselves had merged into one single, unbreakable force, a force that was connected to her in ways she could not understand. The figure before her, still as a statue, seemed to emanate something ancient, something forgotten, an energy that spoke directly to the very core of her. There was no fear, no hesitation in the face of this overwhelming presence, only the unmistakable sense of inevitability. She had been drawn here, and whatever lay ahead was not a question, but a destiny. As the seconds stretched into eternity, the air around her began to shift, the thick weight of the room growing more intense. The shadows deepened, pressing in from all sides until they seemed to pull back, forming a narrow path that led deeper into the chamber, into the unknown. Elara felt her feet move of their own accord, the compulsion growing stronger with each step she took toward the figure. The shadows parted before her, and the path revealed itself clearly now. An archway, a doorway, a passage. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt a jolt through her entire body, as if the very act of stepping forward had triggered something deep within the earth itself. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble in response, and a low, resonant hum began to rise from the depths of the chamber, reverberating through the stones. It was a sound unlike anything she had heard before. No music, no voice, no familiar vibration. It was the sound of the earth itself, of ancient forces awakening from their long, eternal slumber. She moved forward, each step slow and deliberate, as if the earth itself was resisting her advance, or perhaps preparing her for what lay ahead. The chamber around her seemed to shift again, and she could feel it. Something was changing. Something was being revealed. The air grew thick with the scent of earth and stone, the weight of centuries pressing down on her. At the far end of the room, the air shimmered with a faint, bluish light, and in the center of the chamber, something slowly emerged from the shadows. It was a pedestal, old and worn, its surface chipped and cracked with the passage of time. Upon it lay a small, delicate box, its design intricate, adorned with the same strange symbols that had appeared in the obelisk, the walls, the fruit. The fruit within her satchel pulsed once more, its light flickering, as if answering the quiet call of the box. Elara hesitated for only a moment before she approached the pedestal. As she drew closer, the air seemed to grow warmer, and the low hum that filled the room became a deep, vibrating resonance, a vibration that coursed through her chest and into her very bones. Her hand reached for the box, trembling slightly as she touched the smooth surface. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy shot through her, a bolt of power so intense it nearly overwhelmed her senses. She staggered back, her heart racing, but the box remained in her grasp. The lid of the box creaked open slowly, as if it had not moved in centuries, and inside was a small, crystalline object, clear and almost transparent, but with a faint, inner light that pulsed softly. It seemed to glow with an energy all its own, a soft, rhythmic pulse that matched the beat of her own heart. Elara could feel the pull, the undeniable connection to it. It was as if the object was calling her, whispering to her in a language older than time itself. She reached forward, her hand trembling as she lifted the crystal from its resting place. As she did, the room seemed to exhale, as if a breath had been held for centuries and was now released. The hum in the air grew louder, more insistent, until it vibrated through the very stones of the ruins. The crystal grew warmer in her hand, its pulse quickening, matching the frantic rhythm of her own heartbeat. And then, as Elara held the crystal in her palm, she felt it, a surge of understanding, a flood of memories that were not her own. Images flooded her mind, visions of the past, of an ancient time long before this place had fallen to dust. She saw the city in its prime, its streets bustling with life, its people vibrant and full of energy. She saw the obelisk, the fruit, the same symbols that had guided her here, each piece part of a larger, unfolding story. And in the center of it all, she saw herself, an ancient version of herself. Not the girl who had wandered into this place, but a soul long ago bound to these ruins, to this power. The memories flooded her, one after another, each one clearer than the last, until she understood. This was her destiny. This was why she had come. She had always been a part of this place, part of the power that lay dormant within it. The crystal in her hand pulsed brighter, its glow blinding, and Elara felt her body begin to resonate with it, her soul intertwining with the energy that emanated from the crystal. The room around her faded, the chamber dissolving into a sea of light, and she was no longer standing alone. She was one with the ruins, with the energy that flowed through them, and through the earth itself. The past and the present fused together in a single, unstoppable force. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, it stopped. Elara found herself standing alone once more, the chamber still and quiet. The pedestal, the box, the crystal, all of it was gone. There was nothing but the remnants of the energy that had once filled the room, the faint hum of something ancient still vibrating in the air. The light from the fruit had dimmed once more, its pulse steady, yet distant. But Elara was changed. Something within her had shifted, something fundamental, something that could never be undone. She could feel it, an awareness, a connection to something far greater than herself. The journey that had begun with the discovery of the fruit, with the unlocking of the ruins, had reached its end. Or had it? As she stood there, the weight of what had just happened pressing in on her, Elara realized that the path ahead was not one she could see, nor could she understand. She had awakened something, and in doing so, had become something else entirely. But the final resonance of the shattered soul had not yet fully played out. The world around her had changed, and so too had she. The question, now, was whether she could accept what she had become, and whether the world, too, would accept her.